I'll never forget that night. The night when what was meant to be an elegant family dinner turned into the prelude of a mystery that would upend everything I thought I knew about my life. I'm Michael, 39, and as I sit here recounting these events, I still struggle to piece together how a single, seemingly small detail unraveled a tapestry of secrets. We had booked this elite establishment weeks in advance. The ambience was immaculate. The soft hum of classical music, the delicate clink of fine china, and a crowd that whispered of exclusivity. My parents were seated next to me, a comforting presence anchoring me in familiarity, while across the table sat Sarah, my wife, radiant as ever. Beside her was our 8-year-old daughter, Molly, whose innocent chatter added a lightness to the atmosphere. Sarah's family was also in attendance. Her mother, her sister Lauren, and Lauren's husband, Andrew. It was the kind of evening one envisions when you imagine blending the best of both families over exquisite food and even finer wine. Now, I have to admit, I've always been the observant one. Maybe that's why I immediately noticed something was off the moment the waiter poured a glass of red wine for everyone. Sarah, who had always been fond of that particular expensive vintage, declined with a subtle shake of her head. At first, I thought it was just one of her whims, perhaps she wasn't in the mood. But then the thought hit me, an unsettling realization that reverberated in my mind. For months, whispers of hope and anxiety had filled our conversations, the anticipation of a new life joining our little family. Yet, as I glanced at her composed yet distant expression, I knew that tonight, Sarah was signaling something important. She wasn't pregnant. I've always prided myself on being in tune with the undercurrents of a situation. The refusal of wine, a detail so trivial to most, had become a glaring red flag to me. We hadn't been together for 5 months, a period when our relationship should have been brimming with the promise of togetherness and shared dreams. Instead, there was a palpable distance between us, a fissure that threatened to widen with each passing second of that evening. As I scanned the table, I could see the conversation flowing seamlessly around me. Laughter punctuated the air, clinking glasses and shared stories that had always brought us closer. And yet, I felt as if I were encased in a bubble of isolation, a silent observer to a celebration that had secretly turned into a battleground of hidden truths. I wrestled with my thoughts, wondering how Sarah's reluctance to indulge in her usual wine could hint at something so monumental. Had she discovered that the pregnancy wasn't real? Or was it something else entirely? A secret she'd been harboring even before the whispers of new life reached our ears? The possibilities churned in my mind, each one darker and more unsettling than the last. In that moment, the meticulously arranged dinner table became a stage where every gesture, every unspoken glance, and every seemingly innocent refusal held layers of meaning. I remembered the countless times we had dreamed of expanding our family, how we had envisioned a future filled with laughter and shared milestones. And now, sitting at the head of this table, I felt that very future slipping through my fingers like grains of sand. The more I observed, the more I wondered. Was this just a temporary lapse? Or was it a prelude to a much larger, more complex deception? The questions multiplied as I noted Sarah's composed yet unreadable expression. Her eyes, which had always been a window to her soul, now seemed guarded, as if she were hiding an entire universe of secrets behind them. I tried to steer the conversation to lighter topics, to distract myself from the gnawing suspicion. I asked about the new projects at work, reminisced about old family vacations, and even cracked a few jokes. Yet, every time my gaze met Sarah's, I was met with the same cryptic indifference. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the brink of discovering something that would change everything. Later that night, as the dinner drew to a close and the laughter slowly faded into the quiet hum of night, I found myself alone with my thoughts. The festive facade of the evening had long since crumbled, leaving behind an unsettling silence filled with unanswered questions. I kept replaying every moment in my head, searching for the point at which everything had gone awry. I realize now that this was only the beginning, a single thread in what would become a tangled web of revelations, betrayals, and unexpected twists. That one refusal of wine was the catalyst that set off a chain reaction, leading me down a path I never anticipated. And as I sit here, penning down these memories for anyone willing to listen, I can't help but feel that the truth is far more complex than I ever imagined. In retrospect, the dinner wasn't just a festive gathering. It was the opening act of a drama that would unravel the very fabric of my personal life. It forced me to confront not only the potential void between Sarah and me, but also the hidden stories that each of us had been carrying silently for far too long. Stay tuned, because the night was far from over. What happened after that dinner would challenge everything I believed about trust, love, and the lengths we go to protect the secrets we hold closest. And believe me, the revelations that followed were more shocking than I could have ever foreseen. I remember the moment I raised my glass like it was frozen in time. I declared, "To the family, and for honesty." I wanted to set a tone, a hint that beneath the veneer of this perfect evening, we owed each other a brutal honesty. With a confident smile that I hoped belied the storm brewing inside me, I added, "Sarah, are you not drinking because of the antibiotics for chlamydia from your bachelorette weekend in the Bahamas?" The words exploded into the air, and for a split second, everything went silent. I swear, you could hear the heartbeat of every person in the room pounding in my ears. A gasp here, a startled look there. And then someone, from across the table, choked on their wine so hard that I could see the shock written in the sudden convulsion. A fork clattered onto a plate, a tiny sound that punctuated the cacophony of disbelief. I stared at Sarah, expecting some sort of reaction. Instead, her face turned ashen, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and something I couldn't quite place. Guilt? Regret? Desperation? Couldn't tell. The silence was deafening, and in that oppressive quiet, every single unspoken accusation hung in the air like a dense fog. Her mother's face transformed before my eyes, shock and disbelief mingling in a way that made it clear this was a truth no one had dared to voice until now. I watched as the polite veneer of our dinner dissolved into a tableau of betrayal. Sarah's silence screamed louder than any words could. I couldn't help but wonder how much of our carefully curated lives had been nothing but a lie. Up until that moment, I had trusted implicitly the perfect marriage, the flawless family image we projected. And now, that image was splintering before me, each shard reflecting secrets I never imagined existed. The restaurant itself, once a scene of elegance and order, became a surreal backdrop to our unraveling. The other guests were oblivious to the drama unfolding at our table, lost in their own conversations, their laughter. It was as if we were in a bubble of our own making, a bubble of lies, half-truths, and hidden transgressions. I searched Sarah's face, desperate for some sign that she might explain away the inexplicable. But her eyes, normally warm and inviting, were cold and distant, a mirror to the chasm that had been widening between us for months. And I couldn't help but think, was this truly about that fateful weekend in the Bahamas? Or was this just the tip of an iceberg that had been forming long before any of us dared to question its presence? The questions tumbled through my mind, each one more unnerving than the last. How had we let ourselves spiral into this realm of deception? And what did this revelation mean for the future of our family, for the dreams we had so carefully built together? As the awkward silence stretched on, I could feel every eye in the room, or at least every eye at our table, fixated on us, waiting for someone to break the spell. I wished I could retreat into the safety of certainty, but all I was left with were the scattered pieces of trust that now lay shattered on the table, much like that fallen fork. In that moment, the festive air of our dinner was utterly obliterated by the raw, painful truth. I realized that this wasn't just a dispute about missed wine or misplaced antibiotics. It was a crossroads, a moment where our lives would change irrevocably, no matter what came next. And as I sat there, swallowing the bitter taste of betrayal along with my wine, I knew that this was just the beginning. The conversation, if it could even be called that now, had transformed our world into something unrecognizable. What had started as a toast for honesty had opened a Pandora's box of secrets that neither Sarah nor I could ignore any longer. I braced myself for what was coming next, understanding that sometimes the truth, no matter how brutal, was the only way to finally begin untangling the mess we had created. Yet, even as I steeled myself for the storm ahead, I couldn't help but mourn the loss of the uncomplicated trust we once shared. A trust that was now irrevocably broken, shattering our perfect picture of family life. Just when I thought the tension couldn't possibly mount any higher, the silence was shattered by the smallest, most unexpected voice, Molly's. I remember it as if it were a gunshot in slow motion. In the middle of the chaos, when everyone was too stunned to speak, she piped up in that innocent, unassuming tone, "Dad, are you talking about Uncle Andrew?" Time seemed to freeze for me. My ears rang, and my heart sank deeper than I ever thought possible. I stared at Molly in disbelief, trying to comprehend the weight of her words. And then, every eye in the room pivoted sharply in unison toward Andrew, Lauren's husband, who was seated just a few seats away from me. Andrew's face drained of color, transforming to a ghostly pallor that made him look like a man caught in a nightmare. I could see the realization hit him like a ton of bricks, his eyes wide with fear and guilt. In that single, heart-stopping moment, the truth I had feared but never fully acknowledged crashed over us. Sarah's betrayal wasn't some random fling at a resort. No, it was far more personal and destructive. She had slept with her own sister's husband. I felt as if the ground had shifted beneath my feet. The room, once filled with the clinking of glasses and polite laughter, was now heavy with an unbearable silence and the sound of my own shattered trust. Each person around the table appeared frozen, as if caught in a tableau of disbelief and sorrow. Even Molly, with all the innocence of childhood, had inadvertently pierced the veil of our family's darkest secret. My mind raced, trying to process the enormity of what was unfolding. Sarah's eyes locked with mine, pleading silently for understanding, forgiveness, or perhaps just an explanation that wouldn't ever come. The betrayal was no longer confined to the realm of suspicion. It had been confirmed by the voice of our daughter. In that moment, the elegant dinner setting morphed into a stage for raw, unfiltered reality. Every clink of cutlery, every shallow breath we took, only underscored the magnitude of our disintegrating lives. The revelation wasn't just a matter of infidelity. It was a profound rupture in the delicate fabric of our family, one that threatened to tear apart the bonds we had so carefully nurtured over the years. I could feel a mix of anger, sorrow, and disbelief churn inside me. How could everything have spiraled to this point? The dinner, once a symbol of unity and celebration, had transformed into a battleground for unspoken sins and hidden lies. The taste of betrayal was bitter, and the consequences of that single, shattering comment from Molly were already beginning to reshape our reality. That night, as I sat at the head of the table with a fractured heart, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The silence that had enveloped the room was not just a pause in conversation. It was the weight of a truth that had long been buried, now laid bare for all to see. And as I struggled to comprehend the gravity of the situation, I knew that the days ahead would demand painful reckonings and choices that might forever alter the course of our lives. I could feel the tension spike to a fever pitch as Lauren slowly turned her head toward her husband. Her face, usually so animated and expressive, was now set in stone, a silent testament to the betrayal unfolding before our eyes. Just when I thought things couldn't escalate further, Molly, with the unfiltered innocence of childhood, added, "Sarah, you told me not to tell Dad about Uncle Andrew because he'd be upset." That single remark shattered any lingering illusion that we were all just enjoying a pleasant evening. In an instant, the carefully maintained facade of our family life crumbled. Lauren's reaction was immediate and visceral. She leapt to her feet with a force that sent her glass flying off the table, shattering the momentary silence that had briefly held us captive. "What the hell is going on?" she roared at Andrew, her voice a mix of betrayal, shock, and a desperate need for answers. The words seemed to echo around the table, reverberating in every stunned heart present. I watched as Andrew's mouth opened, his eyes darting in panic, but no words came out. The inability to speak was as damning as the loud accusations. The truth was too heavy for him to muster any defense. In that fraught moment, Our dinner transformed into a battlefield of raw emotions. The elegant setting, with its gleaming silverware and softly lit ambience, had become the backdrop to a family imploding under the weight of its own secrets. Every sound, the crash of the falling glass, Lauren's furious exclamation, was a brutal reminder that the illusions we had all clung to were nothing but fragile constructs, ready to collapse at the slightest provocation. I sat there, utterly stunned, as I tried to reconcile the images of the woman I loved and the reality that was now glaring back at me. The carefully constructed narrative of our family had been upended in mere minutes. Sarah's eyes, which once promised understanding and warmth, now held a complexity I couldn't decipher: regret, fear, and perhaps a hint of defiance. For a moment, I was overwhelmed by a sense of numbness. The man I thought I knew was crumbling before my eyes, and every tiny piece of my carefully built world was now scattered like shards of broken glass across the table. The collision of truth and illusion was too violent to ignore. I could see each family member wrestling with their own tumultuous emotions, yet no one dared to bridge the widening chasm between us. I felt like an outsider in my own life, a spectator to a tragedy that was both inevitable and wholly unexpected. In that split second, the dinner, once a symbol of unity, had turned into an arena where every lie was exposed, every secret bared, and every dream shattered. It was the moment when the facades we had all maintained crumbled irreparably, leaving us raw and exposed to the harsh light of reality. As the silence stretched on after Lauren's outburst, I braced myself for what would come next. I knew that this was just the beginning of a cascade of revelations that would force each of us to confront the hidden truths we had long ignored. And in that moment of fractured clarity, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. I don't remember the precise moment when everything in me flipped into action, but I recall the thunderous silence that immediately followed Lauren's explosion. A silence so profound that even my own heartbeat seemed to roar in my ears. Then, without a word, I rose from my chair. In that charged instant, my body moved with a cold, almost mechanical precision. My fist found its target in Andrew's jaw with a force I hadn't known I possessed. The blow was so savage that Andrew's head jerked violently back, and he tumbled from his seat, landing hard on the polished floor. I could see the shock in his eyes as crimson began to seep from a gash on his temple, blood pooling rapidly around him. For a fleeting moment, time itself seemed to fracture, each second stretching out as if to emphasize the gravity of what had just occurred. Sarah's scream cut through the chaos, sharp and filled with terror. She lunged forward, grabbing my arm with a desperate urgency as though trying to anchor me back to some semblance of sanity. "You're crazy! You scared our daughter!" she shrieked, her voice a mix of fear and disbelief that shattered any remnants of composure I'd clung to. Her words stung, not just because of their volume, but because they came from the woman I thought I knew so well, my wife, the keeper of our fragile family image. I slowly turned my head toward her, my expression a mix of raw pain and a resolve that bordered on despair. The anger within me simmered beneath the surface, and each word I spoke was laced with the bitter taste of betrayal. "You have no right to talk about Molly after using her to cover up your dirty lies," I said, each syllable measured yet searing with a potency that I hoped would etch the truth into the very air between us. My voice trembled not from fear, but from the weight of 1,000 suppressed emotions, the anguish of shattered dreams and the irreversible loss of trust. For the first time that evening, I saw genuine fear etched into Sarah's eyes. The mask of defiance she had worn so carefully throughout the night began to crumble, revealing a vulnerability that was both heartbreaking and foreign to me. She stepped back as if struck by a sudden realization of the monstrous reality we had become entangled in. In her eyes, I saw not just fear for herself, but for our daughter, for the crumbling remnants of a family that was once built on promises and shared hope. The room was in utter disarray now. The clash of emotions reverberated around the table, the stunned silence of our guests, the metallic scent of spilled wine mingling with the coppery tang of blood, and the palpable tension that now seemed to choke every word we might have otherwise exchanged. I looked at Andrew, sprawled on the floor, his features contorted in shock and pain, and felt a fleeting moment of grim satisfaction that his betrayal had been met with some form of reckoning. But that satisfaction was immediately tempered by a deep, agonizing sorrow. This was not the way I wanted our family to unravel. This was not the legacy I envisioned for the life we'd built together. In that charged moment, my mind raced with memories of every secret, every whispered lie that had led us to this very juncture. I could almost hear the ghosts of promises broken, of trust betrayed, echoing in the back of my mind. The elegance of the evening had evaporated into something raw and brutal, a stark reminder that the truth, no matter how long we try to bury it beneath layers of polite smiles and shared meals, will always find its way to the surface. Sarah's grip on my arm loosened slightly as her eyes widened in a mix of shock and regret. She seemed to realize, perhaps too late, the full impact of her actions, the deception that had infected our home and endangered the very innocence of our daughter. Molly, still silent from the earlier revelation, was now a haunting presence in the background, a living, breathing testament to the collateral damage of our crumbling facade. I could feel the weight of my own actions pressing down on me as I stood there, amidst the wreckage of what had once been a semblance of family unity. Every breath felt like it carried the burden of irreversible decisions, every heartbeat a reminder of the irrevocable damage we had inflicted on each other. In that fractured moment, the concept of justice became muddled. Was I the avenger, or merely another casualty in a war that neither of us truly wished to fight? As the echoes of our confrontation mingled with the distant murmurs of other diners oblivious to the storm unfolding at our table, I realized that nothing could ever be the same. The bonds we had forged over years of shared memories and quiet dinners had been violently severed. I looked at Sarah, her eyes now brimming with a terror that mirrored my own inner turmoil, and wondered if we could ever find a path back from the abyss we had hurtled into. The taste of iron, of blood and betrayal, filled my mouth. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to unravel the tangled web of deceit that had ensnared us all. Yet, in the midst of the chaos, I felt an overwhelming sense of numbness. The physical blow to Andrew was just the outward manifestation of a deeper, far more profound rupture, a break in the very foundation of our lives. Standing there, my body still trembling with the adrenaline of the act, I was left with one inescapable truth. The facade of perfection, the carefully constructed illusions we maintained, were nothing more than brittle glass, shattered beyond repair by the weight of our hidden sins. And as I stared into the frightened eyes of Sarah, I knew that the road ahead would be paved with the debris of our past, a relentless reminder of a moment when everything changed in an instant. The chaos at our table wasn't done yet. As if the violence and revelations weren't enough, Lauren, still seething from the betrayal, rose from her seat. I could hardly believe my eyes as she strode over to Andrew, who was still reeling on the floor, a crimson smear on his face from my earlier blow. In one swift, determined motion, she delivered a slap so fierce that it sent him sprawling back down, his head snapping against the table with a sickening thud. The sound reverberated through the room, a final punctuation to a sentence that had been written in blood and shattered trust. The entire restaurant fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. For a few long seconds, it felt as though time itself had been forced to slow down, allowing the full gravity of our situation to settle in every corner of that opulent dining room. I could feel every eye fixed on us, each guest silently questioning what monstrous drama had erupted at our table. The air was thick with shock, disbelief, and a tension so palpable I could almost reach out and touch it. Then, as if to drive the dagger of truth even deeper, Lauren reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. With deliberate calm amidst the storm of emotions swirling around us, she tapped through her messages and hit play. A recording filled the air, a recording of a conversation that none of us had thought could ever escape the confines of whispered secrets. In the crisp, clear voice of Sarah, the betrayal was laid bare. "I don't even feel guilty. What he doesn't know won't hurt him." The effect was immediate and devastating. A collective gasp rippled across the table. My heart hammered in my chest as the reality of her words crashed over me once again, each syllable a brutal confirmation of the deceit that had poisoned our lives. Sarah's face paled, and her lips quivered visibly as she tried to mask the shock. In a trembling voice, she managed to stammer, "Lauren, where did you get that?" Her question hung in the air, futile against the overwhelming evidence that now lay before us. Lauren's eyes glinted with a mixture of triumph and sorrow. A woman who had borne the burden of knowledge too heavy to ignore. "I knew it. I was just waiting for the perfect moment," she replied evenly, her voice devoid of any pretense. At that moment, every fragment of our carefully constructed reality shattered into countless irretrievable pieces. I felt an overwhelming mixture of anger, betrayal, and a profound sense of loss. Here we were, exposed not just as a family but as a collection of deeply flawed individuals whose secrets had turned our lives into a battlefield. The recording was a weapon, one that had been used without mercy, cutting through the final remnants of any hope that Sarah's lies could remain hidden. The silence in the restaurant was almost unbearable, every diner now a silent witness to the collapse of the facade we'd all so desperately tried to maintain. I could see the devastation in Sarah's eyes, a mirror reflecting her internal turmoil as the weight of her actions came crashing down around her. It wasn't just the betrayal of infidelity or the shattered trust. It was the realization that every attempt to hide the truth had only led us further into chaos. Lauren's counterpunch had not only delivered a physical blow but had also struck at the very heart of our deceit. It forced a reckoning that none of us could escape. The sound of that recording, played out loud for all to hear, was like an irrevocable announcement of war. One where no secret, no matter how deeply buried, could stay hidden any longer. I watched as Sarah's eyes filled with a mixture of regret, anger, and something akin to despair. It was the moment when I realized that everything we had believed about our family was built on a foundation of lies. The perfect image, the carefully curated smiles and traditions. All of it was now nothing more than a facade that had crumbled under the relentless pressure of the truth. In that charged silence, as I looked around the room and saw the shocked faces of our guests, I couldn't help but wonder how we had allowed ourselves to drift so far from the truth. The recording was not just a confirmation of one betrayal. It was the catalyst that exposed a cascade of hidden sins, each more painful than the last. And as the echoes of Lauren's words faded into the stunned quiet, I felt an overwhelming sense of inevitability. This was the point of no return. Standing there amidst the ruin of our lives, I knew that the path ahead would be steeped in regret, anger, and the slow, painful process of confronting every lie that had led us to this moment. Our family, once a picture of unity and hope, now lay fractured before us. A stark reminder that even the most beautiful illusions can crumble when the truth finally finds a way to break through. In the midst of chaos, I did what I knew I had to do. Without a backward glance at the wreckage of our once perfect dinner, I gently scooped up Molly from her chair and led her out of the restaurant. Each step felt like an irrevocable break from a past I no longer wanted to be a part of. A past filled with lies, betrayals, and shattered illusions. The cool night air outside was a stark contrast to the stifling tension we'd left behind, and with every step away from that cursed table, I felt a fragment of my old self crumble into dust. "Dad, wait!" Molly's small voice was lost under the escalating clamor behind us. I hurried her along, wrapping an arm around her shoulder in silent reassurance. I had to protect her from the toxicity that had infected our home, from a mother whose secrets had now become weapons. There was no room for guilt or regret on this dark road I'd chosen. Only the pursuit of something purer, something real. Before I could reach the car, a desperate shout tore through the night air. "You can't just leave." Sarah's voice, raw and laden with panic, echoed after us. It was the sound of a woman now utterly unmoored from the life we'd built together. A woman whose once commanding presence had been reduced to frantic pleas. I could hear the underlying tremor in her tone, a mixture of anger, sorrow, and a desperate need to cling to a crumbling illusion. I kept my eyes fixed ahead as I reached the car. My hands shook slightly as I fumbled with the keys before finally inserting one into the ignition. The engine roared to life with a heavy, deliberate rumble. With one final glance in the rearview mirror, just long enough to see Sarah's silhouette darting after us, I pressed my foot on the accelerator and locked the door, severing any chance of being pulled back into that vortex of deceit. As the car sped away into the darkness, my mind began to sift through the wreckage of the past few hours. A lifetime of carefully maintained lies now laid bare by unyielding truth. In that solitary moment behind the wheel, a peculiar clarity took root. For the first time in 4 long years, I wasn't trapped in a web of false promises and hidden betrayals. I was free from the suffocating expectations, free from the constant undercurrent of deception, and, most importantly, free to rebuild a future on honest foundations. The road stretched out before us, a ribbon of possibilities illuminated by the pale glow of streetlights. With every passing mile, I felt the heavy burden of my old life lighten, replaced by a cautious optimism I hadn't dared to feel in years. Molly sat silently in the back seat, her eyes reflecting a mix of confusion and a dawning understanding that nothing would ever be as it once was. I couldn't explain everything to her now. This wasn't the time for details or for dwelling on the past. But I could promise her that I would protect her from the fallout of our fractured family, that I would forge a new path for the both of us. As the city lights dwindled in the rearview mirror, a subtle smile began to form on my face. A smile born not of joy at the pain inflicted, but of relief at the possibility of starting over. The familiar landscape was receding, replaced by the promise of an uncharted future. Each mile I put between us and the restaurant was a step toward reclaiming the person I had lost in the labyrinth of deceit and betrayal. In that quiet, accelerating solitude, I realized that this wasn't merely an end. It was the beginning of something entirely new, a liberation from a lifetime of pretense. I knew the road ahead would be fraught with uncertainty and the echoes of past mistakes, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was ready to face it head-on. The dashboard lights cast a soft glow across the worn leather of the seats, and as I drove deeper into the night, the weight of what I'd left behind faded into the distance. I wasn't sure where this new journey would take me, but I was certain of one thing. I would no longer allow anyone to confine